and welcome to Taking the Scenic Route, Scenic Regional Library's bi-weekly podcast. I'm Steve Campbell, the library's director. Our podcast provides listeners with a closer look at the library, including interviews with upcoming program presenters, information about new and existing services, interviews with authors, book recommendations from our staff, and much, much more. So let's jump right in and get started. My first guest is Dr. Kenneth Johnson. He's a career educator and retired professor from the School of Education at Lindenwood University. Prior to working at Lindenwood, he was a high school principal in the Rockwood School District and a teacher and administrator in the Hazelwood School District. Dr. Johnson grew up in Central Missouri, and he is the author of the 2015 book, Moonlight Serenade to City Lights, which is a pictorial history about the bands and musicians who played in dance halls around Missouri. For our community read, he will be presenting Moonlight Serenade Dance Hall Musicians in Missouri on April 3rd, which is a Thursday, from 6 to 7 p.m. at our New Haven branch. And he'll be presenting the same program on Thursday, April 10th, from 6 to 7 p.m. at our Wright City branch. Dr. Johnson, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
I really appreciate it. Let's get started. You have an education background, which is not a music or history background. So what sparked your interest in dance halls?
I lived in one for 3.5 years when I was a young lad, around 10 years old. And fascinating time for me. Every Saturday night, a band would show up to play at that dance hall that I lived in. It was listening to music, watching people dance, having fun. And then I moved on in life, but I never forgot that. Eventually became a history teacher in high school. And as I'm looking at what are things that are out there in history that people may not know or remember, I thought of the dance hall. And I thought I wanted to put that together as a history reminder for my family. And that's what it really was for, would be for my children, my grandchildren, and my other cousins and relatives, that there'd be something written about that dance hall that was very important in the life of our grandparents and parents. So that was really the background for it.
So you do have a history background. I saw that you had been a principal and administrator. I didn't realize that. That makes a lot more sense now that you have that history background. What town was the dance hall in?
It was 3 miles south of Morrison.
Okay.
And many people will say, well, where's Morrison? And I usually say, well, it's close to Gasconade, which does not help at all. But it's about 20 miles west of Herman, which many people have heard of.
That's in our district. That's our library district out by Herman, and Morrison is, yeah.
Yes.
So Morrison's a pretty small town, only a few hundred people probably at that time. Doing your research, I know, like, for example, back during the vaudeville days, every town had a vaudeville theater. The performers would travel around to all the different vaudeville theaters around the country, and every little town had one. That was people's entertainment. Did every town in Missouri have a dance hall during this time period?
I absolutely cannot speak to every town, of course.
Sure.
I know that in the east central Missouri area, it is almost startling to think at all those small towns that did have them. I know I have a list of them right here in Lewistown in Japan and Japan, or however they want to pronounce that T, Fredericksburg, Rhineland, Gasconade, Stolpe, Silver Hill, Leslie. I could go on and on. Tiny villages, almost nothing. Very few people lived there. Very nice communities, but very few people. They had a dance hall.
Wow. So it sounds like every little town did have a dance hall during that time period.
Very much so. Or out in the, if not right in the town, shortly, 2 or 3 miles outside of the town.
And what decades are we talking about when we talk about the dance halls in Missouri?
Started growing in a little bit in the 20s, but it was the 30s. A lot of the dance halls went up in the 30s.
Okay.
And they stayed.
Okay, so 30s through the 50s then?
Oh, yes, and into the 60s even.
Oh, okay. So can you talk a little bit, you did in your book, of course, but can you talk a little bit about the societal or social significance of these dance halls at the time for these communities?
It's hard to kind of maybe for us to understand, but back then, if you're living in one of these small towns, remember, you don't have television. They may or may not have radio. And the big social affairs generally were around the county fairs, which was usually once a year. Churches always had church picnics, and then that would be the big social event. But there wasn't much. And especially during the Depression, whenever people were having trouble with jobs and earning money, it seemed logical for a lot of people, and I know this from in interviewing them, to build a dance hall or to form a band, because they could make $4 or $5 a night playing in a band. And so, but they needed the dance hall. So the dance halls and the bands all grew a great deal during the early 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
People in these small towns needed to make money too, and they found out if they built a dance hall and they could pay a band that to come and play, they could make money by charging 35 cents for a person to get in, or 25 cents, or 50 cents.
Oh, so there was an admission for all these dance halls then.
Oh, I don't think there were any free unless it was a wedding. If there was a wedding, then the people who were the family who were having the wedding party would allow everybody to come free.
So when you say this was like this was a social draw for the community, was this only for adults, or could kids, all people of all ages, go to these dance halls?
Now, that's another really good question, and it's very interesting. These are family affairs. It was
Oh,
like
wow.
the community came together, everybody brought their kids. Now, you say that today and mention a dance hall, and people would shake their heads and wonder what you're thinking. But back then, they brought their little children, age 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The dance halls had rooms for the children to sleep in while the
Oh,
parents were dancing. And mothers would take turns going in and checking on these children. And this is very common in like the one I grew up in, Becker's Place, but other dance halls, Lewistown, they're just, there was one, Van Buren's Hall, they did it. Many of these dance halls had a room for the families and the children, the world for the children to stay in, but for the families to know that they're safe in that location.
that's incredible. So should I assume, maybe I shouldn't assume this, should I assume that most people think dance halls, they're probably thinking like modern day dance clubs or clubs, which of course, they have alcohol, but with the kids being involved, I'm going to assume that they didn't serve alcohol. They didn't have alcohol at these dance halls.
Every dance hall that I know of served alcohol.
Okay.
They all did. Many of them would have it in a different location, of course.
Hmm.
The one that I grew up in, the dance hall was upstairs. The food and beverage area was downstairs. You could go down, have a soda or a beer or eat a meal,
Hmm.
but nothing was allowed to be up on the dance floor. They wouldn't allow any drinks or beverages up there, no cigarettes up there. It was very clean kind of area in a way. And that's where the children were, and that's where the parents were.
Wow. So they're built-in daycare for the parents who wanted to go to the dance hall.
Yeah. So, yes.
What type of music were they playing in the 30s through the 60s in these dance halls?
Some of it is still popular today, like the waltz, two-step. That music you'll still see that being done today on dance floors. They played the polka.
Oh,
They
wow.
did something called a schottische, a very interesting dance. They would do square dances. Many of the dance halls that I went to, they would also at some time do a dance called the broom dance. Today, of course, you'd never see this done,
Mhm.
but it was always a dance with a partner. That's one thing that's changed greatly. You can go to a dance hall now and you can see people dancing all by themselves, many people dancing all by themselves. But back then, that did not happen. You always had to have a partner.
How did you find all the information for your book and this research?
Once I decided to do this, and it was for my family. I mean, that was entirely what it was. I decided to start talking to people I knew that lived in the area where the dance hall was, and that grew. It's like the limbs of a tree. You start out with one little limb, and you ask a person questions about their experience in the dance hall. And then you ask them, "Who else should I talk to?" And they give you 4 or 5 names, and then you go to those individuals, and then you keep growing and growing and growing. And I started talking to musicians who were still around, and
Wow.
it grew. I spent over 10 years doing research on it and talked to I mean, this is during when I was working, so it was I did it on a part-time basis, but talked to probably 200 people, interviewed them, and got as many photographs, as much information as I could.
Was there information like old newspapers, historical newspapers about the dance hall events or no?
Well, some of the individuals had the actual flyers that had been posted out in the community.
Oh,
That's
wow.
remarkable, but they did. So I would have posters from 1940 advertising that dance. It's kind of strange because that was, 60 years after I first got involved with this project.
Hmm.
And yet it was in good condition. They
Hmm.
kept them as a memory because they liked the band or it was their family band. And then I would go to newspapers. I went to the first one I went to was the Herman AC.
Hmm.
I looked at newspapers out of Jefferson City, Washington, Sullivan, other areas, collecting information, and then trying to tie it to where I could talk to individuals that played in that band. And I started collecting photographs of the bands. The thing that I still mention is that I was not doing this with the idea of publishing anything other than having information for my family.
Hmm.
And someone said I ought to put it in a book, a friend of mine. And that's when I thought, oh, well, maybe, let's see. And I kept growing, doing the work and doing more interviews and collecting more photographs. And finally, it did develop into a book.
You mentioned earlier, just a little bit ago, that musicians could play at these dance halls and earn some money, like said $4 or $5 in a night. Were all the band musicians local, or did these bands travel around between other dance halls?
I know of no bands that traveled a great distance, but all of them were local. They came out of these little communities in Missouri, East Central Missouri.
Hmm.
Especially, there seemed to be a huge number in the Herman, New Haven, Washington, Owensville, Sullivan area. And I went north of the river quite a while, way up past Hannibal. I went down toward Rolla and I went on Jeff City toward Fulton and Columbia. But boy, that area that I just named was loaded with musicians. Don't know why. A lot of it's a German communities, and maybe that was part of their heritage. But there was a huge number of bands and orchestras in that area.
So, do any of the dance hall buildings exist anywhere?
That's an excellent question. There's one that I recommend that if you really want to know what it was like in the old days, you could go, and it's still there, and it still plays country music. It's really interesting. It's called Stovall's Grove. It's on the old Highway 66, now Highway 100, north of Pacific, Missouri. Stovall's Grove was built in 1935. They started playing country music there. They still play country music on Friday and Saturday on weekends, and you can go there and dance to the old hillbilly or country bands. It's kind of a remarkable place. I don't think it's changed much since 1935. Now, it doesn't
Wow.
take too much adding to think, well, that was 90 years ago. Well, yeah, it's still there and still open. And it placed, the last time I went there with my wife, the place was packed. So it's quite popular. If you really want to know what it was like back then, it's it's still going. Other than the fact they now do some what they call line dances. The line dances did not exist back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but now they do them there. But it's really still going. There are still some other dance halls that are open. Concert Hall in Herman, of course, is still there. City Park Auditorium in Washington is still there. There's a dance hall that's a little south of Morrison that I lived in. Becker's Place is still standing but closed, but the building is still there. And you can still find these buildings existing in different places, but many of them have burned down or been torn down.
Hmm.
Of course, to me, that's unfortunate, but it's just they don't exist anymore. But there are some, but the very best is still Stovall's Grove.
So I've been to the concert hall in Herman before just to eat. The restaurant and bar, of course, is downstairs, but I've never actually ventured upstairs to where I assume the dances happened at the time. It's a fairly small building. I'm guessing a lot of these dance halls were very, very small.
Yes, they were not huge. And like you mentioned, you have to go up long. It's a long dance, a lot of steps to get up to the concert hall in Herman. I've been up there. I went to a dance there at one time when it was actually open playing music.
Wow.
And back then, when they built buildings, they didn't think of elevators or whatever. They just, a lot of them, there were steps to get into. It's
Hmm.
kind of interesting. And a lot of them were built in rather crude buildings in barns. There were a lot of dances in barns, and individuals had dances upstairs in their homes, and they would advertise it, and people would come to their homes to go to a dance. A little different now today. I was fortunate to one time be able to attend dances at one called the Modoc, which is very popular outside of Herman in a little town called Rhineland. I was also able to attend at the concert hall, and then a place called the Roadside Barn, which is 3 miles west of New Haven. And then there was a few others, Lomo Club in Loma, Missouri, and Hillbilly Village out in Jeff City, and that I went to as a youngster. And
So when was the concert hall operating? I've never really asked anyone that there.
well, that started back in the 20s, 30s,
Hmm.
and I would say it probably stopped in about the 1960s, so middle
Oh, wow.
60s.
Hmm. I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but when you were doing your research for dance halls, did you ever hear about the dance hall explosion in West Plains that our community read book is based on?
No, I had
I,
never.
I had I had never heard of it either. I was shocked that a explosion that killed so many people could just be something that people who study history around the state hadn't heard of, because I had never heard of it as well.
No, I had not. I did all of my research between St. Louis and Jefferson City, Columbia, Rolla, north of Rolla, and south of Hannibal, in order just to be able to get it accomplished and focus on the local area. I've been asked to go to the Kansas City area and do the same thing, and I thought, absolutely impossible. It takes too long. It's too
Hmm.
difficult. Also had talked to someone in Springfield, said the same thing. And I said, nope, somebody's going to have to do it down there because it's way too time consuming and so too difficult to spend the time with now.
How many? So you said that as you were doing your research and talking to people, people were giving you photos of dance halls?
Well, loaning me a photo in order for me to make a copy.
Sure,
Nobody ever really gave me one.
sure.
That was a fascinating thing because I'd locate someone, if I could go to their home, I'd go there, and there in the living room, sitting there or hanging on the wall, would be a photograph of this band. And or it would be in a little ledger or a scrapbook, and inside the scrapbook would be the photographs of this band. Some of them I remember would be hanging in places like the kitchen or out in the hallway, but they would have a record of that band that their family member had played in. It was really fascinating,
Wow, that
and
is.
I thought it was remarkable that they would have that. And yes, and I would interview them, and I'd ask information about who played in the band. Where did they play? The dance halls they played. Tell me about a little about their family, how they got involved with it, and then I'd always ask, "May I make a copy of the photograph?" That was a tough one
Oh.
because they did not know me.
Hmm.
Well, I was just a guy coming there to talk to them. Somebody told me their name, and some were very reluctant to give me that photograph. Some would not. One man said I had to take a photograph of it. Another one, I had to leave. I left my wristwatch.
Wow.
That's crazy, but I said I'll leave my wristwatch here. You keep it if you'll let me borrow this, and I can take it and make a copy, and then I'll bring it back to you. And he agreed to. But it was just interesting. This was something very important in her life. It may have been the only photograph made of that band.
Sure. How many photographs do you have in your collection now, your personal collection?
Oh, maybe 200. I would get
Wow.
some are duplicates of the same band, but probably 130, 140 different bands now. I'd say when I published the book, I had over 100, but I've simply, since now, people saw the book and they said, well, I know a band you don't have. And I said, well, I wish I'd have met you 10 years ago or 5 years ago, but some have sent me photographs now that I never had at the time.
Hmm.
But There's a lot more out there. I know that. And there's still dance halls I probably never heard of also. But it was an interesting experience for me. It was just wonderful. I thoroughly enjoyed doing it. And I'm very glad I did. And the people that have bought the book afterwards, I've heard many positive comments about it. They were thrilled to see their little band from their little home and their little community in this nice book. And they were really happy to have it.
Yeah. So you mentioned to me on the phone earlier that you have another book coming out in June. What can you tell us about that book?
Well, it's going to be historical fiction. It's going to be a story about what occurred at one dance at the place that I live called Becker's Place. That was one outside of Morrison, Missouri. I really picked one New Year's Eve dance and described what went on in that New Year's Eve dance because I was there for 3 different New Year's Eve dances and remember them quite well. And I know that people were there. There were different individuals that would come for different reasons. They had different personalities, and you remember them over the years, and different incidents that occurred during the dance and the music that was played. And I've been fortunate enough to, uh, I know this sounds strange, but just about 2 weeks ago, I was able to visit with a musician, a wonderful young lady who played at the Becker's Place Dance Hall in 1950.
Wow.
Now, if you just add that up, she actually played there. At that time, she was a singer and a band, a guitar player with that band in 1950 at Becker's Place. I just talked to her just a couple weeks ago.
Wow. She must be in her 90s, right?
92.
92. Wow. That's amazing. And she probably played there when you were there, right?
Yes, she did. Yes.
Wow. It was your grandparents' dance hall, you said, or your parents' dance hall?
It was my grandparents. My father also owned another dance hall for a period of time in a little town called Fredericksburg.
Hmm.
And that building is still standing, and the dance hall is upstairs there also. Uh,
Wow.
but it's still standing. And then Fredericksburg is a town of about 15 people.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Once again, Dr. Johnson will be presenting Moonlight Serenade Dance Hall Musicians in Missouri on Thursday, April 3rd from 6 to 7 p.m. at our New Haven branch. And then again on Thursday, April 10th from 6 to 7 p.m. at our Wright City branch. You can register for these programs by visiting scenicregional.org/events. Thank you again, Dr. Johnson. I appreciate you joining me.
Well, thank you for allowing me to visit with you. I appreciate it.
My next guests are Chris Miller and Louise Hermes. They will be presenting 50 years of fashion and social influence as part of our community read programming. The program will be at our Herman branch on April 1st at 6 p.m., Union branch on April 10th at 6 p.m., and our Warrenton branch on April 15th at 6 p.m. Chris and Louise, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
I'd like to get started by having each of you introduce yourselves and then tell our listeners a little about your background as it relates to fashion.
I'm Louise Hermes. I've been sewing since high school, so that's a very long time. And I mostly have focused on reproduction clothing for reenactors, theater, and performers. I don't have a particular genre of clothing I've done. I've done everything from medieval, Renaissance, Victorian, Regency, and fantasy.
Wow.
Currently, I'm working at the vintage market. As I'm retired, I'm busier than ever and doing bespoke tailoring for individuals, which means on-demand clothing.
Wow, great. Chris?
Well, I've got a similar background. In fact, that's how Louise and I met, is that we were both costume mistresses at the St. Louis Renaissance Fair for quite a while. And I had started out my costuming journey earlier than that when my daughter got on cast at the Texas Renaissance Fair. And I looked at the price of the clothing and the quality of it and went, oh, I can do better than that.
Sure.
And off it went. And then I discovered that I was truly interested in the history of it and reproductions as close as could be had. And Louise and I kind of partnered on several presentations. It was natural because we were constantly having to retrain and reteach the new cast. And it just kind of went from there.
And do
I'm
the
sorry?
correct research to get it as accurate as
Yeah.
possible. Because similarly to
Yeah.
Chris, my son was cast as the prince in the Renaissance Fair, and they gave me a number for his costume that I thought, oh no, that's not going to happen for a 16-year-old teenager. So I then started into
Yep.
my costume journey at that point.
So in your program, you'll be discussing women's fashion from the time period of 1890 to 1930. What is it about that time period in women's fashion that you both found or find so interesting?
I would say the thing is the fact that it changed so dramatically. We went from very structured clothing that were made for a particular person to something that you could buy in a department store that was more amenable to different sizes and different classes. So we went from very high-end things to very manufactured things. Don't you agree, Chris?
Yeah, and the other thing that I find real interesting about this, or unique to this period, is that prior to this, right, dramatic changes in fashion happened over centuries. You know, you had 12th century, 13th century, 14th century. Those styles were set. 15th and 1600s, now you're starting to see fashion change in 50-year blocks of time. Now all of a sudden you get to 1880, 1890, every decade is a dramatically different appearance to the fashion. And this is the first time in history that happened.
Part of that now is that people are able to travel more frequently. So they got out of their very narrow spheres of influence and started to be influenced by a broader spectrum of things. And also you had your kings and queens that would set the fashion. The Victorian era is called the Victorian era because of Queen Victoria, and the Regency because of Napoleon and those. So they had very time frames that were based on the historical things of the moment and the influences of the hierarchy.
Yeah, Louise and I were talking before we began recording, and it didn't dawn on me till she said it that it really was shocking to me that all the clothing prior to about 1910 or World War I was made to fit, like it was custom made for the individual. Prior to that in history, it wasn't until after that that people went into stores and had different sizes, like extra large and medium and small, and you had to find your own clothes. It never really dawned on me. That's an amazing transformation at that point in history, that things went from being tailor-made to being, tailor-made to being manufactured like that.
Well, and also a big change was that prior to this period of time, fabric was very expensive. You had a lot of time and energy to manufacture fabric. It was more dear than the labor to make the clothing. So the cloth itself was preserved and reused and refashioned and cuffs turned, all of these things to preserve that. When the industrial age happened, now all of a sudden you had electricity and commercial looms, and you had mechanisms, you know, the cotton gin, right? Now all of a sudden it was very easy to get cotton cleaned and ready to be spun, and the price of cloth just kept dropping and dropping and dropping, and that's when you started getting where people could afford to change their look.
The other thing was washability
more often
as well. Because you had to, now these people were doing different things than they had before. I mean, you weren't going out and changing your clothes twice or three times a day just to go visiting. Now you were working. Now you were going out in the street. Now you had to reuse your clothes more often, because even though, as Chris said, the prices came down, it was still expensive. So you needed to reuse your clothing, and you'll find out through history. One of the things we found through research was that you always see these garments that we have some examples of are very small. Well, yes, because they kept getting passed down and passed from person to person, and they got smaller each time as you recut a garment or made it for your daughter or then subsequent daughters. So you'll find that a lot of the garments that are historically found are much smaller leading to people think that there weren't any larger sized people. People have been all different sizes throughout all of history.
Sure. Well, that's a good question because I know that whenever I've been reading about people in history, sometimes they'll talk about when I was a kid or something, I had one suit. That was my like one suit. It's like during this time period in your research, how much clothing did people have? I know like a lot of houses back then were even built with no closets because people didn't have enough clothes to fill the closets with.
No, they had cupboards. What they had was
Cupboards.
a lot more of the undergarment pieces that were close to their body, but the overgarments like the jacket, the dress, that kind of thing. I would say, Chris, 2 or 3. You had your Sunday
Wow.
best.
Yeah.
You know, you would have your outfit that
Mhm.
you went for Sunday because that was your best outfit. And then you had your day clothes, and then you had your working clothes. It would be a passed down thing even in your own life, like your Sunday best, when that got worn, then it was day clothing, then it
Oh,
got moved to work clothing kind of thing.
that's
And they also wore protective clothing over it. So,
true.
you know, you had voluminous aprons that would completely cover the skirting. And, you know, kids wore those pinafores because
Smocks.
those were generally white. Why? Because you could boil them. That was a
Wow.
very durable fabric that you could boil and clean, the same as the undergarments against the body.
Mhm.
Those were changed regularly, but not the outerwear. And you know how much you had depended on your station in life. But it wasn't uncommon to see in a person's will specific articles of clothing being passed down to different people.
Wow.
And so your station of life, you know, that indicated a lot of how much clothing you had.
And wars also greatly influenced fashion of the time frame,
Oh,
because they needed, like say they needed the wools for the military uniform, so wool wasn't available for the women to make clothing, or even for the men's pants and jackets, so they had to try and come up with other sources of fabrications, which were, now you're starting to get into rayon and manufactured cloth that weren't necessarily naturally based, even though rayon is still a natural fabric, it's made from wood pulp. But so you had those things, and it wasn't until subsequent years that you now started getting synthetic fabrics, which Orlons, Dacrons, Lycra, all these other things are added into the manufacturing to make the clothes cheaper, like the different things that you can use to make them stretch. So you had a little bit more give in the fabric, so it didn't have to be so specific to a person. That was part of more of the manufacturing process, that now most jeans have these lycra that's built into them, so they have a little bit more give and things of that nature too.
During that time period of 1890 to 1930, obviously World War I took place. You talked some about the impact the war had on fashion with the materials. Were some other ways that the war impacted what people were wearing?
oh yeah. They, for one thing, as Louise said, the normal sources of fiber to make into fabric disappeared. Right? It went to wool for the uniforms, cotton for the shirts, so the amount of fabric that was available for civilian use was greatly reduced. So now, rather than big long skirts with lots of embellishment and trim, I mean, during the Edwardian period, the 1900s ish, more was more, right? The more lace, the more trim, the more bows, the more, more is more. All of a sudden now, that's a luxury. Can't do it. Don't have it available. So now you've got garments that are shorter, closer to the body, and very simple.
Well, corsets
And,
started to go away because
yeah.
women couldn't do all the things that they had to do naturally wearing a very restrictive corset. So they had to change their undergarments. As Chris said, the skirts got shorter because if they were shorter, they weren't dragging on the ground. Therefore, they weren't as dirty. So they didn't have to be washed as frequently. The jobs that women were doing weren't just now these sit down jobs. They now had to actually work, in some cases now, as we heard through history, in factories. Their shirts couldn't be big and voluminous and fancy because the sleeves are going to get in the way. And
it's a safety issue.
Practical reasons.
Oh, and a safety issue too with machinery and things. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yep.
Hair also came into play at this point. Up till then, women's had to have really long hair, but then, like in the 20s, you see the hair got cut short off. It also was because in the 20s, which is part of the talk that we're doing, is about the whole start, I think, of making things more androgynous. The haircuts were more masculine. They didn't emphasize, like in the 40s, your shoulders were emphasized. In the Victorian era, it was your waist at some times. Then in the Bustle era, it was more your bottom was more accentuated. So throughout history, different aspects of a woman's body in particular were highlighted. So now,
yeah, and then
go ahead. Sorry, Chris.
There was some exuberance of the 20s for those that had survived the horrendous destruction of World War I, came out the other side, and women had a totally different set of experiences than they'd had before, and they were like, you know what? They got the vote. They got, there was a kind of an entire exuberance of that whole decade. They were pushing the envelope with prohibition. And so all of a sudden, the skirts for the first time were above the knee. We had no waistline. The bust was de-emphasized. Hair became, boyish short. And women were seen doing things and going places and being in situations that they would have never been able to do before and have that be considered socially acceptable.
The other thing
that was that
influence of the movies. People would go to the movies and then they would see these actresses in these styles and these outfits, once again, broadening their scope and seeing, okay, that's what I want to emulate. I wanted to look like Greta Garbo. I wanted to look like these movie stars of the time. And they would fashion their own clothing, and they'll see that come into the manufacturing. Then they'll be able to go buy those things at the store. You also saw that with patterns. Even if as a carryover, people were still making their own clothes, you could buy a pattern in those styles. Some of the things that the 20s did as well is changing the direction of the way that fabric was cut. So now it was
that showed up.
Oh, sorry, Chris.
Yeah, I was going to say you really saw that in the 30s with the bias cut gowns from the golden age of Hollywood.
Because that made the clothes form fit the body without having to have a lot of seaming. So that made a nice feminine drape without making it restrictive, which was very innovative at the time.
I don't even need to ask.
It kind of flowed off the body. If you look at the Greta Garbo and the golden age of Hollywood in the 30s, those gowns just like water cascading down the body. And that's because they cut the fabric on the diagonal or on the weave, and it just totally changed the way it moved. And so that's when fashion started becoming more feminine again. And
even with the more masculine lack of structure, this cutting it on the bias made it seem more feminine. So you had a combination of both the technology, the fashion, and women still wanting to look like women.
Well, you mentioned technology. I don't even need to ask questions in this interview. I could just let both of you talk for the whole time. But you mentioned technology. I know just from my own, reading of history and things that time period with the invention of planes and cars and you name it, it was probably the greatest boom of technological advances in history. What are some other ways that fashion were influenced by all those new inventions and new technology at the time? I know you've mentioned several already.
Oh, even zippers. Zippers was big in fashion changes because then women could get in and out of garments easily. The sewing machine so that women could make clothes. You had to actually, with a needle and thread, make your clothes before. Now you could make it much quicker. And then you'll find the rise of those manufacturing houses, which actually led also to problems in manufacturing with fires, and we do have a segment on that in the talk about fires and the danger, because textiles leave off a lot of lint and things like that in the machines, in the neighborhood, in the manufacturing of the cloth. So that created a lot of problems in the different manufacturing houses.
So
Yeah, probably one of the most famous industrial disasters was the 1911 Triangle Shirt Factory fire, or shirtwaist fire in New York City, where 146 primarily women workers were killed in this fire. Part of it was because, as Louise said, the byproduct of all of this is highly flammable. But the other part is that the owner of the factory locked these people in the building. It was a 5-story building. Locked them in because he didn't want them to take unauthorized breaks. So when the fire broke out, there was no escape. And that led to the first rules and regulations of safety around manufacturing was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire.
Absolutely.
And then also, like with automobiles, that led to a whole series of fashions because it was so dusty. That's the rise of the coat called the duster. And, you had people doing sports like tennis and golfing and equestrian sports that were outside of the British hunting, and you had swimming. All of these things created a set of fashions around them.
Mm-hmm.
The rise of activewear, a literal actual category of activewear, and what you were doing at the time. So absolutely.
So, I just know, I know very little about fashion, but I know like in the 1950s, the bikini was the big iconic fashion piece. And then I know when I was younger, they had Calvin Klein jeans in the 80s were the big iconic fashion piece. When you were researching or in your research of the time period we're talking about, 1890 to 1930, were there iconic fashion pieces that people might even recognize today that happened during that time period?
I would say trousers for women.
Oh, wow.
Prior to that, that was unheard of. That was undergarments, not outerwear. So shorts.
And that was for men only.
Yeah, trousers were for men only. But now women were in factories. They were playing tennis. They were doing other things. So you would see that.
You said shorts?
Yeah, they started to.
Well,
have
they were more.
Shorts. They were more skirt-like. But yes, that was the beginning of that.
And then you also, at the beginning of this time period, probably the most iconic fashion element is going to be the corset, because and that the whole rigid posture and, the smoothing out of the torso and all of that corset. Then after World War I, or during World War I and afterwards, the iconic change was the fact that women had legs. You could see them.
But there's also other influences like epaulets, military. You're seeing that throughout history. Think of the Andrews sisters, and what they wore was very militaristic inspired. And you'll see that in different aspects throughout the different centuries, how the military influenced fashion altogether, just in style, let alone by textiles and availability.
Will you both have
and even the colors.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Dyeing was a big thing. Having access to different colors and the dyeing, and how good the dye would stick to the different fabrics and textiles. That was a huge thing.
This has got nothing to do with our particular era, but the reason that the British were the redcoats was because the madder plant that was used to dye the uniforms was readily available in England and extremely cheap. And so that's why they put their soldiers in red. Our Revolutionary soldiers were in blue because we had access to indigo dye, cheap.
But what a great fashion point that is, historically, is the red coats and the blue coats. But why was that like that? Just because what was available at the time in their particular areas.
Will you both have clothing from this time period at your program?
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we actually have examples of exacted or genuine garments from that period, with the exception of the 20s. The one dress I have that is from the 20s is too fragile to travel with. So Louise has a really nice reproduction.
Oh, great.
That we're going to bring out.
Great. Where did you get all these clothes?
So yeah, we'll have.
Sorry, where did you get all these clothes from?
It was kind of accidental in that my daughter has a degree from Northern Kentucky University in technical theater, specializing in costuming. And the fire marshal went through their costume shop and went, too much stuff here. So they were going to have a big garage sale, and they gave the students first dibs. Well, she came home with some items that had been donated to be torn apart for patterns that had been part of the garage sale. And it included some items from the 1880s to about 1910. And then my brother, who worked in a theater in Paducah, they had to do the same thing. And he was like, well, I'll get these for my sister. And then, I've bought some, and it's just kind of gradually gone from there.
If you know what you're looking for, you can also find some of them in antique malls and things like that. A lot of times they're very highly damaged. And what I've done in some of the costuming is you can take some of those pieces, fix them a little bit, and then reproduce the rest of the garment around them. But a lot of them, some of the cotton pieces have lasted longer than some, say, of the silk pieces. So you can find them out there if you know what you're looking for.
You must have a very large closet for storing all that clothing.
Doesn't every American
actually
have a closet?
True.
Yeah. Actually, they're stored in an archival box with cotton between them.
Oh, wow.
And in fact, one of the dresses that are going to come is from Agape Thrift here in Warrenton. I'm the manager of Agape, and this garment came in badly damaged, as Louise said, and it's from, I'm guessing, 1910, 1912.
Wow.
And I was able to clean it up and repair it, and I'm going to bring it to the presentation, and then after that, I'm going to put it on eBay and try to sell it for Agape.
Chris and Louise, thank you so much for joining me. Their program, 50 Years of Fashion and Social Influence, will be at the Herman branch, as I mentioned, on April 1st at 6 p.m., our Union branch on April 10th at 6 p.m., and the Warrenton branch on April 15th at 6 p.m. You can register by visiting scenicregional.org/events. Thank you both so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Well, that wraps up the latest episode of Taking the Scenic Route, Scenic Regional Library's podcast. I hope that you can join me again in 2 weeks when we release our next episode.